All right, we are live here for the live mental health unscripted chat. So we have a conversation every Sunday at 7 o'clock Eastern time zone where we talk about mental health and I respond to the chat. So I put that as a priority. Lately, I've been also going through this book, which is, where is it? Other side. Whoa. The Flip Book for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. It is also Mother's Day, so I do want to start today by giving a shout out to all the moms in the world, at least those who happen across this live stream or watch it later. By the way, if you are watching later, we would love to have you join us next Sunday at 7 o'clock Eastern time zone. And we'll see, because it's Mother's Day, whether we have more people show up or nobody or far less. So that's okay. Either way. We are working through stuff and continuing to build this little community of people who want to talk about mental health stuff. So Mother's Day creates a lot of different emotions for a lot of different people. So there are people that are grieving their mother. There's some people are grieving the mother that they didn't have. Some people are thinking about how grateful they are that they have an awesome mom. And some people are struggling with the fact that either they are a mom and regret some of their decisions or don't feel appreciated by their children, or, some people never got to be a mom, always wanted to be. And so these kind of days bring up a lot of different emotions for a lot of people. Now, one of the things that I highly recommend, if you're one of these people that has conflicted emotions about today, is to take this as an opportunity, not a threat, not something to avoid, not something to cope through. Often, unfortunately, we get in this mentality where we think that only positive emotions are worth having and are good. But in acceptance and commitment therapy and therapy in general, thank you for the like, whoever gave me that like, I appreciate you. But in the acceptance and commitment therapy, we try not to avoid emotions, and we try not to judge emotions as good or bad based on whether they're pleasant or painful to go through, but rather whether they are leading us to live a life that matters to us. So in other words, if an emotion, whether positive or negative in terms of pleasurable or unpleasurable to experience, if it causes us to move into being engaged in the present moment, remembering who we are and living a life that really matters, if we're open, aware, and engaged, there's no such thing as a bad emotion. Rather, what is a bad emotion is the one that we are not processing through and we're not stuffing. So if you're going through Mother's Day things, go through it, but go through with intention. And sometimes what that can mean is having a process that you go through. So whether it's journaling, whether it's talking to a friend, there's so many different ways you can kind of process through your feelings, and meditation, prayer. And as you go through those things, you might find that you come up with some really valuable insights. So with that said, if you are a mother who doesn't feel appreciated, let me say we appreciate you. I'm very grateful for all the moms of the world that have sacrificed and done so much that is often underappreciated and unseen, not celebrated enough. So I am grateful for the opportunity to celebrate that on Mother's Day. And if you have any chat related to Mother's Day, feel free to ask it. Any questions or comments on how you feel about that, we can kind of unpack that together. Even if, and I've mentioned before, and I'll mention probably every week, that there's no confidentiality here. I don't call people out and say, oh, that's Tim Schmidt, who lives on Parker Avenue, right? Or anything like that. But it is a place that's hopefully safe to process. So as long as you're not sharing information that you feel uncomfortable with being out there online, you can definitely share about things that you're feeling or struggling today. How do you know if someone you care about is gaslighting you? Okay, so here's one of the things that I have not a problem with, but a caution with the term gaslighting. Gaslighting often implies intent, and that does matter, but not as much as you think. So, in other words, the question is, are they gaslighting you or not? Right. And the answer might be, well, it doesn't matter whether they're gaslighting you or not, because the fact that you feel gaslit matters enough. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, we try to never focus on mind reading. So in other words, I'm not trying to assume what's going on in some other person's mind. Often it can seem like it's pretty clear what somebody is thinking, but even then I can be wrong. And sometimes it doesn't actually necessarily matter. So gaslighting is when someone is trying to essentially make you feel like you're crazy because they keep changing the environment, but telling you that it's just your perception that's changed. So that's the original, at least, term for gaslighting. So there's a light and the person's dimming it, but telling you they're not dimming it and that you must be going blind. Okay. So it's putting it on you, and they're doing it on a manipulation. So for it to be gaslighting, it takes intent. What often is going on is that the person doesn't feel heard. So feel free to give me follow-up questions or more details on if there's a specific situation that you're trying to unpack. But what's often going on is the person doesn't feel heard. And so that alone matters. If you don't feel heard, okay, let's not assume that they have a negative intent necessarily. But let's also not minimize the fact that you feel unheard in what you're going through, and you feel like they're accusing it of being you that's to blame, that it's your problem, your fault, kind of thing like that. Which, by the way, yes, Ripley is still in her cone. For those of you who saw her just now in the background, Ripley's had a little bit of a rough time, so I haven't been able to shoot new R&R videos for a little bit. She scratched herself so bad, I think based on an infection, or she got infected from the scratch based on fleas. So she got new flea medication, and hopefully I can take the cone off soon. For those of you who are worried, I'm the one that doesn't feel heard. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So like, if you don't feel heard, that's enough, even if the person isn't intentionally gaslighting you. So it would be rare that somebody is, I mean, there are sociopaths, like people do gaslight, but normally what's really going on is just they're responding in their story and focused on what they're going through or how they feel or their experience, right, of reality. They're trying to correct your experience of reality because it's not aligned with them. But that's not what we're supposed to do in conflict resolution. It matters what you're saying, and let's see if they can communicate in hearing it. I do think that communication will go a lot better if we assume that they're not trying to gaslight us. Now, if no matter what we do to communicate that we don't feel heard, their behavior doesn't change, that might be a different story. But I would kind of think of gaslighting as the last scenario that I'm going to jump to. Like, it's the last assumption that I'm going to jump to that they're going. But I do think them not hearing you matters enough. So in other words, we don't have to assume that they're gaslighting us. We can just assume that they're not listening and see if there's communication tools we can do to feel more heard. But feel free to keep on keeping on. Right now the chat's pretty sparse, so share with me more details if you want, or your specific struggles in that issue. So I'm I'm going to go to the book in the meantime that we've been working through. This talks about a negative feedback loop where we get stuck often. So remember, in acceptance and commitment therapy, it's all about being unstuck. And so if we look here in these negative feedback loops, we sometimes are trying to avoid during distressing thoughts or during distressing events, certain thoughts or memories. And then that leads to actually worse emotions. And that can lead to more negative body sensations. And I do some running. And so I often see this with when people are running, that they will be worried that something is going to get injured, right? So the worry is a feeling, right? The sensation is that their knee or foot or something is bothering them a little bit. So they're focused on it, right? And they start to concentrate on that and flex it, right? That tension. Well, if you hold that tension for long enough, guess what's going to come? Pain. So it becomes a negative feedback loop where the very thing that they're trying to avoid, I'm going to let Ripley be a little bit more on camera because she's the cutest, even with her cone. Yeah, she needs some attention right now. I love that little, she's purring. But anyway, so ironically, overly being cautious about a certain injury in running, as an example, will actually make it a negative feedback loop. And you're basically guaranteeing that you're going to have that injury increase, not decrease. And so the same thing is true with our thoughts and our feelings. There's a balance here of how we want to accept and process, but diffuse from them, right? So we want to allow ourselves to feel whatever feelings that we're feeling. The goal is not elimination, but the goal is also putting it in its proper place where we see, okay, these thoughts that I'm experiencing matter. Feeling unheard matters, right? But it is not my entire identity, nor does it define the other person or the entire relationship, right? So a positive feedback loop when something is distressing, here's the positive feedback loop. All right. We're stepping back and letting those thoughts and feelings come and go. We're letting the memories come and go. And sometimes we use the metaphor of a wave, right? Compulsion comes in a wave, feelings come in a wave, thoughts come in a wave, memories come in a waves. Trusting that there probably is some purpose to why we're having the thoughts and feelings that we're feeling, and just allowing them to come and go, right? And same with the body sensations, right? But we're tuned into all of them. We're not detached from that. We just don't see it as everything in our life or our identity. And so this is the irony of, like, when you overly are trying to control your thoughts, feelings, and even body sensations, they actually can get worse and it can turn into a negative feedback loop. When instead I accept, right, those thoughts and feelings, then the next part is to engage in what matters. So I don't use the acceptance to justify not doing stuff. I still engage in what matters, but I do so in a way where I see it not as my entire reality or identity. So let me know if you have any questions about that. So here is the avoidance cycle, which, by the way, let me know, for those of you who are my followers, faithful followers, if you want to keep going through this or go to something else. I mean, this book isn't going to last that much longer. We'll see if we actually might even get through it this week, depending on the chat. But I have other things that we could go through if you want to go through more material or keep it more informal and unscripted, like I originally intended. But anyway, so an avoidance cycle, right, is where we have an emotion or feeling that we experience that we then have, because of that emotion experience and it starting to control us, certain situations or people that we try to avoid. I've definitely done this. So like I have a period in time where a bunch of people were rejecting me and speaking ill of me. And basically I couldn't, or felt like I couldn't be around so many of those people, right? So many of those people were just toxic for me, so I would avoid it. The problem is then my life became so much smaller and more restricted. And this made me feel, so this would be my chart, right? What emotions or feeling did I experience? I felt betrayed. I felt hurt, felt wounded by how people were treating me in the small town that I live. And then because of that, I avoided being around certain people and being at certain places. This made my life far smaller, and I couldn't go to a lot of the events that I loved and felt really great um, at before. And then it made me feel, really self-pity, woe is me kind of story, right? And that avoidance cycle, the problem is it becomes bigger, not smaller. So the more we avoid, the bigger our fears become. Often, if you look at like actually how even things like agoraphobia, which agoraphobia is the fear of losing your house, you think it happens from a traumatic experience, and it can, right? So like an experience, traumatic experience often is at the root of the agoraphobia, but the agoraphobia actually is built by our reaction, not from the trauma, but from the fear that happened after the trauma. So because we had that original trauma that made us afraid of certain things, we slowly and surely try to avoid these triggers because we didn't want to get stuck. And ironically, negative feedback loop, we got more and more stuck, and our world became smaller and smaller and smaller by trying not to experience these things. And the bad news is, the hard thing is that what we often have to do is the exact opposite of what we want to do to start making our world bigger again, right? So we have to stop avoiding those experiences, and we have to start an acceptance cycle, right? Where we accept things. So same thing starts at the same thing. What emotions or feelings did I experience, right? And then instead of going, how do I avoid that? We go, what small actions can you take even with the unpleasant emotions? So just because our chat has been so quiet today, using the example of the gaslighting, right? I might feel gaslit, feel unheard, right? As that experience. What small actions can I take even with the unpleasant emotions? Well, if I want to make my world bigger, not smaller, right? Depending on that person that I feel gaslit by, it might be like, okay, well, I'm going to communicate with them, and I'm going to process through the feelings, and I'm going to journal about it, and I'm going to think through it so that I can be engaged in the life that matters to me. How will your life become less restricted? Well, by talking through with them. I don't live in the narrative where I have to restrict. So, or for, I'll use me an example in a second. Okay. How will this likely make you feel? Empowered, maybe, So that's just an example. Right. So, like at a certain point, now I'll be honest, I did avoid those interactions for a while. And part of that might have been necessary. So when it comes to experiential avoidance, obviously in acceptance committed therapy, we want to give you tools to help you not have to avoid negative and triggering experiences. But there's some degree in which you're human. You have limitations. We all do. And sometimes you just have to avoid those certain things. I was in a stage where could I have pushed myself maybe a little bit more? But ultimately, I was patient with myself. I accepted that I wasn't comfortable in certain circumstances, and I gave myself time to grow into that. But ideally, and now more often, I process the feelings, but I also remind myself that their rejection isn't really defining who I am, and I am still enough. And then I can make small steps where I can still go to certain things, but I don't have to make it where I'm trying to make them happy or have them not be thinking I'm a bad person or whatever, and just live my life, which makes me feel way more free to be unapologetically me. And that makes me feel content, peaceful, and happy, whether I have people being negative or not. Does that make sense? If so, let me know in the chat. or if you have any questions. Autonomy of an emotion. Okay, so here's the thing, and there's a book that talks about the body keeps score or something like that. I'm butchering, too mind numb today to think through the name of it. The body keeps score or something. The body feels things. Point is, our emotions are actually processed throughout our entire body. So even our heart, oh, thank you. I got a compliment down there. Pastor Richard is the best. Good stuff, brother. I appreciate you. So autonomy of an emotion, we're feeling it. We feel it even in our gut, right? You know, that sinking feeling in our gut. I had this one experience where I was supposed to go to this conference that I was mandatory to go to, and I really didn't want to. It was in Gainesville, I want to say. As I drove, I got sicker and sicker. Thanks for the like. Got another like on the video. Appreciate you. And I got sicker and sicker till like finally I was like, I just can't go. And so I told my boss at the time that I'm sorry, I'm too sick. And he's like, no, don't worry about it. Just go back home. Like 30 minutes into driving home, I felt 100%. Now, I was not consciously trying to make myself sick. Consciously, I was really thinking I was coming down with something and thought this was physical, not emotional. But sure enough, by the evidence of the fact that 30 minutes down the road, I'm 100% and feeling great. I even honestly thought about turning around and like, well, I'm actually okay. But then I was like, if I turn around, I might end up feeling as sick. And I was already given permission to leave. And I feel weird about admitting that it's like, I don't know, probably it was an ego failure there. But either way, I did go home. The point is, that's how powerful emotions are to our body. You can actually make yourself feel sick, right? So those thoughts, those feelings, all of them. And here's the other thing. Evidence says, research shows that the more we try to avoid certain emotions and feelings, the worse it feels in our body. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of therapists will be like, where's that emotion showing up with you physically? Because the more you try to repress it, so you could actually think of it like in your mind and you try to press it down, and what's going to happen, it's going to go into your gut and your body, and it makes you feel worse and sicker. So sometimes what we have to do as we process through that is focus on the body first, which is honestly why I like dance therapy. Ice bath therapy can also work like this, but we relax ourselves so that we can then unlock and go into that emotion. But if you notice that you're holding tension, there's pressure, you're feeling physically restrained or oppressed, all of that matters, and you can process through, because you do experience emotion throughout all of your body, not just in your brain. All right, identifying small steps to exercise your will. So the reason we call it ACT is because eventually we want it to live into action. So eventually we want people to move into, engage in a life that matters to them. So the first thing we write down is things that matter to you. Right? What are the things that matter? We're not going to do like a conceptual value list, but you could be like, oh, my friends, it's like my church, or my cat. My cat matters to me a lot. Yeah, she's the best. Poor little girl in her little cone, the cone of shame, as they say. Important things I've been avoiding because of anxiety. So this helps us understand our motivation and to see why we're getting stuck, because we're seeing the things we're hung up on. If we're avoiding certain things because we might feel anxious from them, which, by the way, it's a positive correlation between a purposeful life and an anxious life. So in life, if you want to live a life rich with meaning, where you do things that you truly value, just know anxiety is very likely going to come, especially at first when you start processing those purposeful, meaningful things. So like the more you care, the more you're going to feel anxious about stuff, right? It makes sense. The solution to living the best life is not living a life where you're not anxious about anything because you don't do anything you care about. That doesn't make sense at all. Thank you for the 100% and the hearts and fire stuff from the chat, guys. Yeah. Oh, hi, Ripley. Ripley's like, why am I not being pet more? So think through important things I've been avoiding because of my anxiety and write that down. Small things that are important to me that I would be willing to do even with anxiety is the next category. So that's the last one on this page, right? And so that's probably the most important thing. So that's one of the ways that we can process through stuff is we can think about what am I? This reveals our value, right? Because our true value are the stuff that we're willing to do even though we don't feel good, right? The stuff that you're willing to do when you feel good, the stuff that you're, dedicated to only in the sunshine, that's not your real values. That's not the stuff that really is going to pay the dividends in your life. It's the stuff that you are going to do even when it's storming, right? The stuff that no matter what, you're dedicated to do. Those are opportunities that you can exercise your will, right? So you can move into a life that matters and engaged because you're focused on doing that through your anxiety. The more you practice that, I think I got another thumbs up. Thank you guys for that. The more you practice that in life, the more you build the skill to be able to. So little small exercises of will where you accomplish doing something that you set your mind to, even though it makes you go through anxiety, is building this new resource to help you not get stuck in the future, if that makes sense. All right. Now that brings us to moving into difficult experiences. So this goes through two different categories: situations, what will you do and when, and then time, how long will you do it? And so part of ACT is the basic kind of like goal setting thing. So we're going to think through the situations, what we're going to go through in those difficult circumstances, and then we're going to prepare ourselves for how long we're going to go through it, even though we're going to feel unpleasant. So I had a friend who was a nurse, and I've used this before in different metaphors and speeches and stuff, but like the nurse will come to you with this huge needle, and she'll be like, or he'll be like, this is a male nurse, but he'll be like, it's just going to be a little prick. And then they stab you, and it's like, that's a little prick. Going even with the Band-Aid metaphor where they like, just rip it off like a Band-Aid, which I've given people that advice before, but it's actually not clinically accurate. So the Band-Aid is pulled off in one motion for the sake of the nurse, not the client. Okay. It's never actually helpful to pull off a Band-Aid super fast. It's actually smarter to do it very slow and very methodically, right? But all that to say, it's the same thing of like saying it's a little prick. It's not actually for the patient. It's not better for the patient. It's better for the nurse. They don't want to have to say, hey, this is going to be really painful. So my nurse friend who used to work with terminal illnesses and, cancer stuff, and so like very serious things that people were going through, he would do the opposite of what was considered appropriate bedtime, or what do they call, not bedtime, bedside manners. He would do the opposite of that, right? So all the like, it's going to be a little discomfortable. He would actually make it sound huge. He'd be like, this is going to be very tough. There's going to be times where you're going to want to quit. And he'd go through all of the possible negative experiences that they're going to experience. And then he goes, in those moments, have faith. You're going to get through it, right? I've worked with many clients before who've gotten through it, and I have faith in you. You can do this, right? So it was, he was actually complained about at the hospital at first by his supervisor when they found out he was doing this, until they looked at his numbers. And they've basically found that all of the patients that had him, or not all of them, but a significantly statistically bigger amount of them, actually went through the whole treatment. Whereas most nurses had way worse numbers. So he had better numbers than the rest of the hospital. And they paid attention to that enough that they started to make it the new policy. Because telling people how bad it's going to be before it's there actually prepares them and makes it more likely that they can go through those negative experiences. So what we're asking you to do in this moving into difficult experiences part is actually do the same thing for yourself, right? To visualize going through these really difficult experiences, to remember why they're very meaningful for you and why they're important, and to kind of process through and push through those things. The more you tell yourself, this is going to be really tough, but I know why I'm doing it. I know how long I'm going to do it for, and you're prepared for it, the easier it is, if that makes sense. All right, so now remembering who you are, this is the self-context exercise, or one of them. So there's a narrow sense of self. In narrative therapy, we'd call this your problem story, right? This is who we say that we are when we're feeling bad about ourselves. And it's usually something that gets us stuck, right? Oh, nobody ever understands me. Nobody ever appreciates me. Nobody ever loves me, right? Now, in the expanded sense of self, we still want to include that as one of the things, but then we just want to include other experiences that tell different stories and look at how there's all these different contexts as we do this, right, where the story doesn't quite fit of that narrow sense of self. To start to remember that we are far more than the limiting stories that we tell about ourselves, right? So I had somebody actually today say that they were, what was it? It was the black sheep, right? The black sheep, that's their narrow sense of self. I didn't go through this exercise with them, but that's what I would have done. So it would have been like, oh, yeah, what other roles did you play in the family, right? I did actually challenge them a little bit that I said, do you think your family would agree that you're the black sheep? And they said, probably not, right? So that was a little diffusion technique, but this one would probably have been a better one, to go through and say, well, what other roles did you play in the family? Were you always the black sheep? Did you sometimes play the peacemaker? Did you sometimes, were you sometimes the advocate? And then people are like, oh yeah, well, there's this one time that I did this and this one time that. And they might still be like, but I usually default into, right? And this is our negative filter. And when we tell a story about ourselves enough time for enough years, we are really good at seeing everything that confirms that story and really bad at seeing the stuff that doesn't. So it can be a very reinforced belief about ourselves of this narrow sense of self. And that's why it's really good, repetition matters, to practice thinking through of all the different aspects of who we are, all the different personalities. Okay. Then there's the ACT matrix. This is one of the biggest ACT tools that we use. It's very simple. Is this moving me away from what matters or towards what matters, right? This is the end all be all in ACT. If it's something that is moving me towards what matters to me, it's a good thing and I want to keep it and have more of it in my life. If it's moving me away from the things that matter, then I want to have less of it in my life. Okay. So what action or behaviors do you do when the inner stuff shows up to move you away from what you want, right? What is your coping response? What is your go-to thing that you typically do when you have actions or behaviors, or when you have inner stuff that shows up that is moving you away from what you ultimately want in life? Are you an isolator? Are you somebody who displaces and projects, right? Note that down and process through that. What actions or behaviors can you do that would move you closer to your actual goal, right? So if your goal is in being engaged in what matters, what would move you towards that? And then we think through that. So what inner stuff like thoughts, memories, emotions, or body sensations show up when we move away from what we want, and who and what matters to you. So we're going to values again. What do you desire? What do you want in your life? Right? So we're thinking through that, and then we're thinking through on each thing in our life if that's moving us towards or away from that. That's one of the things that I would go through with clients a lot is, instead of focusing on whether a story about ourselves is true or untrue, we could say, is it helpful or hurtful? Is it moving us towards a life that matters or away? Because if it's moving us away, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's not a helpful thought. What would be a helpful alternative? And we want to go with something that's similar, like we're not going, the opposite, right? Because it's still based in somewhat of a reality, right? Or we probably wouldn't believe it. But ultimately, it's usually not 100% reality. I say humans are not great at knowing what's true or untrue. We shouldn't create that as our litmus test. We should rather think of it, is it fruitful or is it fruitless, right? Is it moving us towards or away? And this gives us to the choice point part of ACT, right? So in every situation, we have a choice point. And this is obviously a very simplified thing, but it happens a lot. It's a daily, sometimes moment by moment experience where we can be hooked by something and we move away from our goal, right? We become lost in the struggle. We avoid those feelings. We move away from the things that matter to us, or we are willing to move forward even if it's uncomfortable, and we move towards a life that we ultimately value, right? So we think through, what are the away moves that I could be making if I'm responding to the things that hook me? And what are the toward moves I can make, right? And it's not like things that you think are way too high a bar for you. It's reasonable things, simple things that you know you could do, right? Things that can help me get unhooked and move towards the life that I value. Okay, so let's talk about hooking for a little bit, okay? When a fish gets hooked, all right, it's like it wants to pull away, and the more it pulls away, the more it's going to get stuck. So similarly, the more we try to pull away from certain thoughts or feelings, the more likely they are going to hook us. And certain thoughts and feelings are going to be more likely to hook us. Pay attention to what those are. That matters, right? Often we have to lean into it to then get out, right? Same thing with the Chinese finger trap, right? You get stuck when you're trying to pull it away, you push and then go, right? So we can do the same thing with our thoughts and our feelings. And the more we practice that skill, the more we're not afraid of dealing with any thought or feeling. So think about situations that you're dealing with and the thoughts and feelings that show up for you. If that makes sense. And some of you might have heard of SMART goals before. I went through this in school, so they did teach me this in public education. SMART is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-sensitive goals. And this is just a SMART goal matrix or workshop. You can find a bunch of these online that you want to go through, of some things that are specific, short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. Things that are measurable, achievable, relevant. Oh, it was relevant. I think, did I say realistic? It's been a while since I've learned this. And timely, right? And we just go through and we create those SMART goals for us. Right? So I'm not going to go spend much time on that one because I think there's a lot of tools out there that are helpful, or a lot of workshop or the SMART stuff. There's a lot of SMART stuff you can research on yourself if you're interested in that, but it's kind of self-explanatory to me. Okay, so this is the ACT bus. This bus represents your life, and you are the driver. Throughout your life, you've been taking on a lot of passengers. These are different thoughts, emotions, memories, and so on, right? So these aren't like people in your lives, but you might have a projection of a person that's on your bus, right? In other words, you might have somebody that's renting space in your mind. It might even be somebody that's no longer in your life, but they still are riding on your bus, okay? Some of these passengers are very nice. Some of them, neutral. And others are like scary, difficult, overwhelming, okay? Some of them are helpful, some of them are hurtful. All right. The ones that are the monstrous have the tendency to be very loud. Right. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Right. There's these passengers that are bullying you, right? As you're trying to drive the bus, they're in the back going, "Watch out, Alan! Watch out! Why'd you do that? Why don't you do that?" Right? When this happens, you might spend all your time trying to push those monsters off the bus, but then your bus ends up going nowhere. Okay? Or you might try to make a deal with those monsters, right? These are different thoughts and feelings that you have, going where they tell you and agreeing to keep your life small, right? So you've got a fear and you're listening to that fear and you're letting it drive you. But that won't live you to a full life. Instead of letting these monsters tell you what to do, see what it's like to just bring them along for the ride, right? So they can stay in the back of the bus without determining the direction you actually take in life. Does that make sense? Ask yourself what matters and how you want to live, right? So in other words, what it's actually saying is these thoughts and these feelings that we have, when we're trying to detach from them, we're trying to push them away, it doesn't usually work. One is we can't keep driving the bus. We have to actually pull over. I'll turn this bus around right quick. That'll end your precious little field trip. Tommy Boy? No, that's Happy Gilmore with Chris Farley. But anyway, we'd actually have to stop moving forward to deal with that monstrous passenger. Sometimes you might have to, but generally that's not a good idea, right? Because you're actually still letting that thought or that feeling control you by stopping the bus and trying to throw it off. And sometimes you can't throw off a feeling no matter how hard you try. It keeps coming back and with a vengeance, okay? So these negative thoughts and feelings, just allow them to be there. But remind yourself that they don't control you and they're not driving the bus. That's the point of the bus metaphor. So a lot of the stuff with ACT, what we're trying to do is not necessarily learn to control our thoughts and feelings. People think that's what we're doing with some of these skills that we're working on. What we're actually doing is learning to accept them, just not let them control us, right? And that's actually how we typically get unstuck and free from them. What you might find is that those monstrous bus passengers that you've got, right? Those thoughts and feelings that you don't like might have more of a purpose than you realize. All right. Someone said, "Well done, sir. And yes, SMART goals sound familiar. Also hope your fingers are fine." Oh, yeah. I cut myself. Actually a couple times, not intentionally either time. One was actually throwing a knife that I needed to shave off and clean up. So I did clean that up and it's good now. But also one was a freak accident where I had this razor blade that slit me because it's a long story. But anyway, I am fine. No big deal. Right. That's just how life, that's how the cookie crumbles, as Jim Carrey says in Anchorman, I want to say. Accept, but do not allow it to control. Yeah, and that's what I'm doing with my finger. I accept that my finger is cut. It is limiting on some things I can do, right? But I'm not going to let it control me, and I'm still going to go on and live my life. I'm not going to overly focus on it. I forgot that I even had it. Okay? Does that all make sense? So anyway, that's it. That's the end of the book. So the last thing is that ACT bus for the metaphor. So since it is Mother's Day, and since we have a pretty quiet chat, if we don't get a couple of questions, I'm probably just going to end it a little early. But please do let me know if you're one of my people, to whether you want to go through more things like this, or want to have specific videos on specific topics, or just want to keep it open to talk about whatever. But we are going to be here again, 7:00 Eastern time next Sunday. So we'd love to have you. And we do appreciate your questions. So anybody, please do tune in, tell your friends, get them engaged. This is free. So it's almost like free therapy. And either way, I do appreciate those who showed up and watched, and wish you all a happy Mother's Day. And I'll see you guys next week. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.